for the invitation. As a scholar, perhaps like most of you, there's nothing I appreciate more than the chance to look at familiar ideas through very different and unfamiliar lenses. And in that sense, for me, the conference got off to a great start this morning. I just hope maybe I can also, in some way, help clear the path for the presentations that are to come. I look greatly forward to them. And one more remark, if I may. We usually think of footnotes as a kind of academic courtesy to readers to let them know where an idea came from or maybe where it's going. Like footprints, they're much less interesting to the story than the text itself. But given the still drier and dustier nature of the paper that I prepared, I'd like to turn that convention on its head and present the footnotes as a series of slides to accompany the text, and then perhaps distract you occasionally from the tedium of my remarks. The picture of nothingness that I'd like to lay out here today is really no more than a very small snippet cut from a tapestry too immense and too intricately spun to take in all at once. And that's only the weave on the front side. With a bigger talent, I might have turned it over to look at the entanglements and the crisscrossing of so many slender threads of ideas wound together over the course of the long intellectual history of Japan to produce the conceptual bundle that we call nothingness. I'm tempted to pause here and own up to all the limitations that model my arguments, as well as enter into the chronic mesh of jargon that philosophers use apparently to clarify the concept. But I think all that's out of place here. My aim is really much more modest. To argue that seen from Japan, talk about nothingness is nothing to take lightly. What's the most absolute thing you can say about reality? What's the class of all classes? The universal of all universals? In other words, what's the most general concept that can be thought to embrace every thought we have about reality? At first sight, the concept of being can't fill that role, because everything that is always becoming. Insofar as beings are radically relative to time and space, no one being can represent the permanent universality of the most general of all concepts. For the scholastics, being is only real when it's tied to a particular essence. That is, when a substance to hold that being in place and allow it to retain its individual identity is present. And since essence cannot actually exist without accidents, that is, properties subject to change, to be real is to be impermanent. This suggests that it's not the fact of being, but only the quality of being, or beingness, that could be said to be the universal of all universals, that which makes reality real. But if beingness were that which gives reality to everything that exists, the concept would seem empty, or at least redundant. It begs the question of a universal concept for understanding reality by introducing a tautology. For a being to be real is for it to possess the quality of being. At the same time, if becoming were the all-encompassing universality of reality, the class of all classes would be unstable, which would defeat its role as a stable universal. But now, what if there were a discrete and superior being in reality whose essence was beingness, and which was not subject to change? This would mean that than which nothing greater can be conceived, the words of Nanzan, would not be merely an idea, but would actually be present among all the many beings whose reality is limited by becoming. This is how Anselm came to his notion of God as a being without becoming, without having to define God as simply the totality of all reality. It's also implied in Aquinas' theory of participation, in virtue of which all real beings share in the beingness of a being whose very essence is to be without becoming. This whole line of argument, including the Aristotelian assumption that the actual existence of everything that is real is possessed of an underlying substance, was foreign to Japanese philosophy prior to its contact with Western thought. The tradition that it was fed from India through China considered the notion of substance to be bound to a provisional but ultimately illusory view of the world. To be real was to become, and becoming was always the constellation of concrete but impermanent conditions, not the continuation of an essence which remained more or less stable as its properties underwent change. Given the central role that the concept of a supreme being or a prime mover played in Western philosophy, dialogue with that tradition made it necessary to find a place for the concept of God. Not surprisingly, the Japanese philosophers were more sympathetic to pantheistic thinkers like Spinoza, or the panentheistic tendencies in German idealism. These sympathies were not so much a way of taking sides in a long-standing debate within Western philosophy, as they were an attempt to absorb the whole discussion into their very own but very different perspective on reality. To begin with, Japanese philosophy admits, as a matter of definition, that to be is to become. Everything real, without exception, is caught up in the flux of coming to be and passing away. There is nothing in human experience to indicate otherwise. The class of beings exempt from becoming is a class with no members, a metaphysical fantasy that for all of philosophy, and not just the worldviews of East Asia, holds true. Instead, if that reality that is always coming to be something other than it happens to be at any moment, the question remains, but where is it ultimately coming from? And the answer is nothingness. Now, this is important. The notion of nothingness is more than a simple counterposition to the philosophies of being. For one thing, prior to contact with Western philosophy, there was no such universal in the philosophical traditions which shaped the Japanese notion of nothingness. Strictly speaking, there was not even a word for being in the sense of beingness, until there was a need to come up with one in order to translate the Western concept they were meeting. The word they chose meant having at hand, and its opposite, nothingness, not having at hand. So when we read in English translations, for example, of the Tao Te Ching, that being is superior to non-being, or that being is generated from non-being, this is a complete anachronism, imposed from a recent century on a phrase that refers to the presence and absence of things. So from the very beginning, nothingness was not parasitic on the notion of being. It was not a negation of being or a qualification of being. Nothingness is not part of a dualism, as it was in Parmenides, or it was not the dualism of potency and act that we find in the scholastics. Nothingness flourished as an idea without any concept of being. Its dualism, if you wanted to talk about that, would be the dualism between appearance and reality, about dealing with the objective world. Not as Descartes did, as an object for subjects, because the subject-object dualism was also absent, but simply on its own merits, which we'll talk about in a moment. This helps explain and this is a story that I'm not really competent to tell, why science did not grow out of Oriental philosophy. Without Descartes and the subject-object dichotomy, which now, this morning, everybody is taking aim at, we wouldn't have had the argument that we're having today. Science did not develop out of nothingness. That's the fact as well. In any case, that said, the varieties of nothingness in Eastern philosophy are as many and as different as varieties of the concept of being from Parmenides to Heidegger. Unlike notions of nothingness and non-being, defined in opposition to the universal of being or beingness, the nothingness we're talking about here emerged from traditions of thought all their own. To look on ultimate reality as nothingness is to affirm in part that which holds the identity of individual things in place through time is impermanent, not a substantial essence, but a constellation of conditions which are forever in flux and centered everywhere. If these constellations are manifestations of something not subject to change, the final horizon of reality cannot be a manifestation of some superior, unconditioned thing. It can only be a non-entity, not in the simple sense of something lacking the reality that actual entities have, but as a nothingness that can never be reduced to a particular, identifiable thing among other things. But nothingness, despite the feeling the word evokes, is not primarily a negation of anything, let alone a negation of the universality of being.
Sorry, Jim, can I just ask, what character or characters are you translating as nothingness?
Mu.
Thank you.
Okay, and that was the character on the original screen. A little bit difficult to see, but yes, that's it. And I'll show the characters again later. So this is important actually for very subtle reasons, but I hope I might be able to touch on those. But so it's not primarily a negative concept, let alone a negation of the universality of beingness. It's a positive concept all its own, whose logical consequences entail certain negations, but is more than the sum of those negations. As the most abstract of all abstractions, the universal of being is a common denominator that compresses things into unity by distracting from the specificities that make them what they actually are. It's a kind of shared identity which overrides individual identities, a principle of unity that wraps the many into the one. The universal of nothingness is less abstract. Its aim is not so much to structure reality rationally around a principle of unity as it is to protect the fragile harmony of diversity. For this reason, it would be the crassest error to think that nothingness means nothing at all exists. To make such a claim would require a place from which to review reality and conclude that none of it is actually there. A claim that's already refuted by the very fact that it can be made at all. On the contrary, nothingness begins from the affirmation that everything exists just as it is and not as our dim rational credentials would like it to be. There's no underestimating the stimulating effects that Western philosophies of being had on Japan. Among the young scholars dispatched to Europe in the 19th century were those charged with studying philosophy, which the authorities had long supposed to be the cradle of science and the crucible of ideas that made modernization possible. Unlike the technology, industrialization, and the structuring of financing, schooling, and politics, there was never any thought of transplanting whole forests of philosophical thinking into the soil of Japanese culture. It was always a way to understanding how the West understood itself in order to advance Japan's place in the community of nations. It took some time to settle on a term to find the right word to translate philosophy, one that would define it as an academic discipline without having to redefine Japan's own intellectual history as a subset of the West's. It was only in the last decade of the 20th century that resistance finally broke down, and talk of Japanese philosophy came to be seen as a source of pride rather than as a vestige of colonialism. The story of how that came about is inseparable from a circle of scholars that formed around the illustrious figure of Nishida Kitaro, the so-called Kyoto school, and their philosophy of nothingness. Most of what I have to say here is drawn from what I've read of their work. I've no mind to make their case for nothingness sound more familiar than it is. Not that it's more unreasonable than I make it out to be, just perhaps more disagreeable. We tend to dislike what we do not understand. That, more than anything, is what drives our aboriginal desire to know. But when the pretense of having understood takes over, we no longer even know what we like. So let's be clear, the idea of nothingness throws a sabot into the wheels of Western philosophy. And if the sabotage that philosophies of being worked on the Japanese mind produced something new and unexpected, I see no reason not to expect the same from the introduction of philosophies of nothingness into worldviews by and large unprepared for them. The idea of nothingness feeds on and broods over a long history of ideas marked by three interlocking persuasions. The idea of reality as an appearance empty of stable content, the idea that letting go and wonderment are superior to clinging and certitude, and the idea of the self as a guiding but ultimately misguided fiction. None of these ideas, of course, is without clear analog in the history of philosophy that traces its origins back to the Greeks. But their crystallization about the idea of nothingness gathers and directs reason into a distinctive view of the world. I find it useful to single out maybe 4 salient aspects of nothingness, each of them associated with a Japanese term that helps keep them in context. Mu, Engi, Soku, and Muga. Let's begin with Mu, the absolute of nothingness. Everything that's real has its identity. It's a oneself, an itself, a himself, a herself. By definition, an identity is what holds an entity in place and keeps it from disintegrating into its surroundings. To be in place is to have a specific locus within a defined place, which functions as its embracing universal. Without it, it would not be possible to locate anything. This is as true of ideas as it is of the people that entertain them. Take the simple judgment, the willows are green. The locus of that idea is the conscious mind. It is what it is because of the reasoning mind that defines it so. But now clearly the mind is not identical with the judgment it makes, because judgments that refer to a place outside consciousness, a wider place within which the mind is located. The claim is that the willows are green, but the fact is the willows are not green where the claim is. They are green somewhere else. The awareness of a thinker thinking thoughts thus holds within itself a kind of contradiction that breaks down the walls of the mind to open up to a wider horizon of a world that can be thought about, an intelligible world. To be known is not all there is. Something must also be knowable. The mind can no longer be understood by itself, but as one element in a more embracing, intelligible world of being and not being. The world that is always coming to be and passing away in time and space. The fact that the mind is part of that world means that its will to know is not the final will. The mind's desire to know is located in a world that desires to be known, for the simple reason that it includes mind. This coincidence of opposites, the mind's desire to know and the world's desire to be known and evolve into mind, leads us to ask where the universal of will or desire itself is to be placed. The only answer is nowhere. Will or desire as such is not a function of any higher entity. It's not located anywhere, does not belong to anything. It is, to borrow Hegel's term, absolute, cut off. It's the final place beyond which nothing in the world of being and becoming can embrace it as a more encompassing universal. It's a universal of mu, of which it can only be said it does not itself exist and yet is manifest in everything that exists. The most obvious thing you can say about reality, the universal of all universals, the place that envelops all places, is that it's not a universal or a place at all, that it has no identity in existence because it has no defining place, and precisely for that reason its reality is manifest in everything that has its place in existence. Conversely put, the idea that things are defined and limited and have identities only has meaning against a background that is indefinite, unlimited, and unidentifiable. There can be no final place to embrace all places any more than there can be a time before time, or a cause of causation, or an unenclosed universe. Far from negating the world of being or minimalizing it, nothingness is its most positive affirmation. It's the one thing that cannot be negated, the one thing that everything that is bears witness to. It's not that it lacks any defining qualities, but rather that no defining qualities could exist except against a background that's not limited by them. It's like a series of concentric circles, each providing a location in existence for what it envelops until the final circle fragments and scatters into a nothingness beyond being. This resume may make it seem that with slight adjustments, the notion of an absolute mu would be fairly well covered by the idea of a supreme being or an unmoved mover. For example, theologia negativa, the affirmation of God through the negation of anything that the human mind can affirm about a divine being, would seem to overlap handily with the reasons for introducing the idea of nothingness. These ideas, by the way, I have abstracted from Nishida's logic of place. There are three main reasons for resisting this line of argument. First, the metaphysical function of mu is different from that of a supreme being. Its primary question is not where do things come from, but where are things located? It's not a matter of the whence, which seeks to explain the present as the repository of past causes, but the dominant idea is rather of the where, which seeks the conditioned context within which things take place, the landscape that allows for meaning and meaninglessness, harmony and disharmony, intimacy and isolation. Cause and effect are not denied, they're only denied primacy. Second, the mu is not apophatic. It's not understood by what it is understood not to be, or by what we cannot understand. The word nothingness quickly grates on our assumption of what it is to be affirmative, to be positive, to be meaningful for human beings. Furthermore, if one cannot have direct contact with nothingness or describe its presence in concrete terms, it can hardly be expected to fulfill the role of a loving, provident, saving deity. Indeed, when Nishida first came to realize the need to replace being with nothingness as the foundation of philosophy, it was at the end of a tortured attempt to understand how one could be a knower and a known at the same time. His immediate fear was that he had simply capitulated to mysticism. but it didn't take him long to realize how rich a vein of thought he had tapped into and how much more there was to say. And finally, Mu contradicts the idea that an unchanging, unmoving, transcendent being can be either ontologically or morally absolute. I'll have more to say of this later. In a word, the idea of Mu comes down to a fundamental option about reality. Either there is some being that is not becoming, which would put it in a supernatural reality other than our own, or dismiss it as a delusional, imaginal non-being. Or else there's something in reality that neither is nor becomes, something that is not at all like anything we define as existing. This unlikeness, as Nishida said, shreds the outer limits of our most abstract ideas and scatters them in all directions, like an outermost circle drawn with dotted lines about the series of concentric circles by which mind classifies the qualities of particular beings. Secondly, we come to the notion of Engi, the interconnectedness of all being, which someone was asking about on the break, Pratitya Samutpada. The guiding image of the way nothingness is manifested in the actual world is the connectedness of all things, not just in the mind or among human beings, but all things. If everything that exists in reality is always coming to be and passing away, then nothing is really only itself, and always only itself. Things literally are their connections, and things that are disconnected are not. That is, they are not. They don't exist. This, simply put, is what is known as Engi, the permanent affinity of all things with one another, of which relationships among humans are only a small part. The only thing of which it can be said that it is always and everywhere connected to everything is not a thing at all. It's connectedness. Each universal or each class of beings is defined by its connections. And that's what we might call the universal of all universals, the class of all classes, the absolute. It's not an absolute being, but an absolute relatedness. Nothing in reality is unrelated, and relatedness itself is present throughout reality precisely by not being attached to any single item in reality. Engi is not an illusion. It's not nothing in the sense of being cut off from being. On the contrary, its nothingness is what allows it to be present in everything. Of course, how connections work is relative to where an entity is located. The varieties of human perspective, which are dependent on our bodily senses and the instruments that extend them, allows us to see connections and to manage them in consciousness. Lower animals have quite different sensual perspectives that enable them to navigate the immediate connections with their surrounding world. And the farther removed this is from consciousness, the more perspective becomes associated with autonomic activity. But in all cases, everything that exists is a bundle of relations, and its surroundings are a field of vectors that hold it in place and make it what it is. What makes nothingness real, and not a mere empty medium in which reality exists, is this absolute, unknown, and uncontrollable connectedness. Far from a meaningless void of non-being, nothingness is the crucible that makes meaning possible. The ultimate mystery of meaning is less a question why there is being rather than nothing, but why everything that exists comes to be in relation to everything else. Engi is a name for that mystery. Nishida's first and most notorious successor, Tanabe Hajime, suggested that nothingness is dynamic, a pure power or potential to exist that only exists as a connecting force. This is important. There's a lot in that little phrase there, but nothingness exists as a force, which is different from a power, which is a force that hasn't been activated. he doesn't want to identify nothingness with potentiality. The actual bond that directs the force to give continuity to things in space and time, these bonds are no less intangible except in their manifestation. They're just more easily identifiable. What energy and gravity are to material reality, culture and society are to immaterial realities like thoughts and feelings. He spoke of this as absolute mediation, by which he means that nothingness is not only manifest in actual connections, but in the binding power as well, like the interlapping petals of the dahlia that separately and together give specificity to the life that flows through the flower's stem. This binding, he insisted, requires more than an empty void for interaction among individual entities. The dialectical logic by which a thing is said to be only in virtue of what it is not the whole of the dynamic of nothingness. To understand the reality of Mu is to identify it as a concrete force and not just an abstract power. This should be kept in mind as we turn to the final two aspects of nothingness I've chosen to discuss here, Soku and Muga. Soku is the logic of nothingness. Under the influence of his lifelong friend, D.T. Suzuki, Nishida was drawn to a logic of correlativity expressed in the term Soku. He needed a way to deal with the way in which contradictory elements combine to sustain the identity of individual beings. The logical status of this contradiction was not a simple synthesis of opposing elements, as we find in Hegel's dialectic, but a way of preserving the opposing elements. Its goal was not to harmonize a dualism of coexisting principles, but rather to rethink the binary opposition of yes, no, as both yes and no, and at the same time neither yes nor no. This may seem to land us in a logic that is ultimately self-contradictory, or at least incapable of making up its mind about the nature of the relationship between contradictory elements. Obviously, Nishida and his circle understood logic as more than a set of rules, as in traditional formal logic, about how to use language, how to make sense of the world. Logic was understood broadly to represent the basic structure of thought that aims to make the real rational, without flying off to some ideal world or losing itself in abandoning rational thought. The only rational way to express the interconnected reality of the world was to refuse to affirm the identity of any individual without including its reliance on its surroundings, and at the same time without denying that ultimately reality does not cater to the demands of language and its aversion to contradiction. The mixture of sense and nonsense that is the inescapable fate of Homo loquens needs to be reflected in logic, and this is precisely what Soku does. It's not easy to find an equivalent for Soku in English, just as it's difficult to find a precise way to express the copulative is in Chinese and Japanese. Their grammar is more fluid than Indo-European languages, with their tenses and declensions, definable parts of speech. Even with adjustments that have been made to accommodate the translations of Western literature into modern language, Chinese and Japanese grammar retain a native flexibility that can be deceptive for the translator. A word in Chinese can be a verb, a noun, an adjective, an adverb, all those parts of speech. They simply don't make sense. In Japanese, not quite as loose, but still very, very loose. Until you start trying to translate a Western text into Japanese, you have no idea how much our thinking relies on our declensions and our conjugations of verbs, as well as on our parts of speech, and what happens to those thoughts when they're deprived of the parts of speech. Be that as it may, Soku is commonly rendered as sive, qua, or as I myself prefer, in. But none of these quite give the same feel to the way that Soku functions in actual use. Explanatory paraphrasing is still worse. At the same time, there's nothing particularly mysterious about the mutual entailment of life and death, divinity and humanity, transcendence and immanence, and so forth, which the copulative soku implies. Nor is it hard to understand the self-denial of rational clarity in the face of the unclarity of the real world. It's just that we don't have a simple word to carry that load. Thus, when we say death in life, or divine in human, I and thou, we mean not only to preserve the dialectical relationship of opposites as essential to an entity's reality, like two sides of a piece of paper that need one another to exist, but also to bend that paper into Mobius strip so that one side flows naturally into the other. Nishida famously captures this in his enigmatic description of individuation as absolutely contradictory identity. This same pattern holds for the soku that binds being and nothingness. The formula nothingness in being, being in nothingness, is cited frequently as a shorthand for the logical axiom that the reality of nothingness only becomes apparent among things that exist, and that being is only real because it appears against the background of nothingness. To this we add Tanabe's corrective that the logic of soku is never a pure abstract relationship among ideas, a union of contradictory concepts, but is always colored by the specific cultural conditions in which the concepts are located. Insofar as mu can be thought, it is shaped by the specificities that affect where and when that thought takes place. And finally we come to muga, no self. There's only so far we can go in thinking about what happens when we're thinking. Like a mirror facing a mirror, what's reflected recedes into smaller and smaller images that erase whatever clarity there was without ever really allowing us to grasp it as it actually is. In the end, there's no place we can stand in the world to make the world an object unaffected by our thinking about it. Conversely, the thinking self is like the one rock among the 15 that disappears from view no matter where you sit in the famous rock garden at Ryoanji Temple in Kyoto. We can only think of reality in medias res, in the thick of it. The idea of the human subject as an unmovable point of reference for objective truth is the ultimate illusion, and the idea of nothingness is the mind's way of acknowledging that illusion. If this acknowledgement is allowed to run its course, it does not stop at a rational proposition about the limits of reason. It marks an awakening to a nothingness self, or a muga, which in turn determines the goodness of the good life amidst the irrevocable interconnectedness of the world. At this point, the influence of Buddhist philosophy comes into clearer relief. Only late in life did Nishida begin to give Buddhist language a place in his writing, making explicit what had been there all along in the background. The same is true of Tanabe. After his turn to metanoetics, a philosophy of moral conversion, occasioned by a rigorous self-examination of aspects of his thinking that had kept him from taking a stalwart stance against Japan's militaristic engagements in the Second World War. His successor at Kyoto University, Nishitani Keiji, was more forthcoming from the start. His writings offer a lodestone for Buddhist elements latent in the philosophy of Mu that he had inherited from his teachers Nishida and Tanabe. This is nowhere more clear than in his idea of muga. As an idea, muga, commonly translated as no self, is a critique of anthropocentrism carried out from within the unavoidable anthropocentrism of philosophy. Nishida saw it as overcoming the subject-object dichotomy. Tanabe approached it as the rational disruption of reason. Nishitani is a kind of self-overcoming of self-centeredness. But purely as an idea, the point is the same. all human perspective on reality is a function of mind that occurs as part of the actual interconnected agency of existing beings, but is not required by. The self that thinks about the world marks the emergence within the history of the world, of a capacity for subjectivity that is capable not only of a high degree of consciousness, but also of subjecting the non-self-conscious world to objectification, instrumentation, and representation prone to distortion. In short, anthropocentrism. Simply put, Muga seeks to restore mind to its place of honor in the history of the world, and at the same time to avoid its self-destructiveness. This begins with understanding the primordial state of the self as no self, and acting from a standpoint of Soku, in which the relationship of self to no self can be realized. So although we normally think of the self as the positive and the no self as a negation of the self, the Muga is more the original state. It's what we are, and self is a negation of Muga. It's a no self. Nishtani speaks of this as a standpoint of emptiness, a term he generally prefers to nothingness because of its connections to the Buddhist ideal of no self. And this is the importance of the question he asked. There is a Chinese character for sky, which is a translation of the Sanskrit term shunyata, which is a zeroness or nothingness. And this is the concept that has figured very prominently in Buddhism, although Mu is also present in Buddhism and Taoism and the other traditions of China as well. So Nishtani prefers the Buddhist concept, but no difference in meaning. Nishtani's Muga is an emptiness self, a self that becomes what it truly is only by emptying itself of itself. Thus, when his successor at Kyoto University, Ueda Shisteru, introduces the phrase, "I am I by not being I," he's speaking of more than an idea of the nature of human consciousness as a dialectic that correlates self and other. Muga is always a question of taking an actual stand in the world. I am only truly an I when I dislodge the I from the center of my worldview and carry that over into practice. For this reason, the connectedness of Engi and the logic of Soku are not meant as a metaphysic or an ontology that can stand on its own. They're a rational foundation for the practice of no self. Following hints that Nishida scattered in his final essay, Nishtani took up the Christological image of kenosis as a way of universalizing the idea of a no-self beyond its Buddhist expression. The self-emptying of a super-historical, supernatural being into the historical person of Jesus discloses the true essence of the divine and the human at the same time. The total and irreversible negation of the image of a detached, disinterested, absolute, and transcendent being who creates the world, holds it in existence, and directs it back to its point of origin, opens the way to an affirmation of a divinity in humanity as a living symbol of reality itself, as nothingness in being. Takeuchi Yoshinori, a disciple of Tanabe Hajime who followed Nishtani in the chair of religious studies at Kyoto University, likened kenosis to the Buddhist transcendence of the world through a transdescendence into the world. A worldview based on such an idea of transdescending the self is neither theocentric nor anthropocentric, but rather what he calls anthropoexcentric. One becomes fully human only in vacating self-centeredness and for the harmony and welfare of all beings. The rejection of self-centeredness is not a rejection of the ordinary self, let alone a depreciation of humanity. On the contrary, it's confirmed at those times when the mind feels most centered in the world. If only for a fleeting moment, everything, just where it is just where it should be, in the no self-centeredness of mind. It is in this sense of oneself becoming connectedness. It's the nothingness mind viewing the world from the standpoint of emptiness. And the use of the image of Christ as a transcending yourself by emptying yourself of God doesn't mean that he has in any sense committed to believing in the objective existence of a God, or let alone of a divine God. It's the image, the symbol, that interests him. Any affinities Nishida and his circle felt towards pantheistic views of the presence of God in all things is incomplete without an understanding of the true presence as self-emptying or indiscriminate love. The incorporation of theological imagery into the meaning of nothingness for the realization of true selfhood is, of course, in no way intended as a literal theism or a literal atheism, but neither is it simple agnosticism. Rather than dislocate God from philosophy, the aim is to relocate notions of absolute being in a quest for true humanness, freed of any illusion of the individual self, human or divine, as a self-sufficient, self-enclosed center. In so doing, the relationship between the absolute and the relative is radically changed. Rather than contradictory attributes that cannot, in a two-valued logic, both be true and not true at the same time, the two are linked through the soku, absolute and relative, relative and absolute. The relative is the absolute with the lining turned out. Reality is absolutely relative, with no exceptions, which is to say that it is relatively absolute. Nothing is absolutely absolute, or only relatively relative. Accordingly, the most comprehensive and rational expression of reality, just as it is, the all-embracing universal of all universals, is the engi of interconnectedness. An absolute cut off from the world by pre-existence or independence. An absolute that is absolute in itself and not for others is more than an abstract ideal. It is a rejection of reality as it is. As we've been saying, nothingness is only absolutely real in its appearance as the tangled web of relations that make up this world, as it comes to be and passes away at every moment. Accordingly, Muga is not a non-existent self, but a fully conscious existing self. It's fully aware, fully alive, in death to the illusions of selfishness, in the loving, compassionate, responsible, and clear-thinking mind of self in other. Its self-denial is not a capitulation to the meaningless of our nature, but the beginning of acting most naturally and in harmony with who we really are. Nothingness shines nowhere more brightly and positively than in the self that exists in full awareness of its connectedness to others. To be in love is to exist in the original likeness of divine love. This is how Japan's philosophers of nothingness appropriate stories of God into their view of reality, as a collective image of one to whom those dead in the world are still alive, of one who lives most fully in the world by dying to otherworldliness. It should be obvious that the philosophy of nothingness developed by the Kyoto school philosophers and roughly sketched just now through the classical ideas of Mu, Engi, Sogu, and Muga reach beyond the confines of their Asian birthplace. As I remarked earlier, if nothingness can be transplanted into foreign soil at all, it cannot be expected to produce the same fruit, but it can alert us to fugitive elements in our own tradition that have become marginalized or otherwise neglected. Again and again, the spontaneous affinities that these philosophers have felt with esoteric, mystical, and hermetic ideas nudge us out of the clear orthodoxy of the mainstream and into the muddy backwaters of our own arcana. Start to finish, their writings on nothingness represent a dialogue with Western philosophy that has fractured our tidy assumptions about the role the intellectual history of the East has to play in philosophy's pursuit of a universality that does not collapse into uniformity and certitude. and the way in which this is reflected in aesthetics, morality, and religion. The context of the idea of nothingness and the relative positioning of that context in a broader worldview is too important to extract the conceptual ingredients alone and assimilate them into one of the other varieties of a philosophia perennis. The Hebrews is still more visible in attempts to treat the idea like an appendix or a new row of patches stitched onto the edges of an already motley quilt of Western philosophy. What is needed is not a mere accommodation, but a disruption and restoration, similar to the one that Nishida and his circle initiated. The Japanese style of pottery known as kintsugi is a good image of the formative reconstruction. Ooh, looks like I'm going the wrong way here, sorry. There we are. The formative reconstruction that's already underway. The art of kintsugi dates back to the 15th century art of creating beauty through the repair of broken clay vessels. A lacquer mixed with gold dust is used to fix the pieces back together. The veins of gold show both the wounds and their healing in a way that a smooth glaze could not. They give value to the finished composition at the same time as they highlight the fragility of its origins. What you hold in your hands is a reconnection with a broken past, an image of the temporary nature of all our handiwork, intersecting with the desire that it last forever. It reconnects time, which moves from one fragment to the next, to the irrepressible but always uncertain longing for reparation. It's an image of the mind itself as it strains for the wisdom to restore unity to ideas disrupted by novelty, to recover a unity that never quite holds. The philosophers of the Kyoto school have left behind an impressive record of how debate with philosophies of being can enrich philosophies of nothingness. It's still too early to conduct an audit on movements in the opposite direction. What we can say is that once the idea of nothingness has intruded into the history of the notion of being, neither tradition of thought can be the same. In the search for balance in imbalance lies the beauty of philosophy. And that's something we cannot afford to take lightly, not as long as we revere our native instincts to be reasonable and to live in harmony with the world that first delivered us over to them. Thank you.
Do you want me to chair questions for you?
Sure. Oh, yes. I'd love to have some questions.
We started 10 minutes late, so we'll 10 minutes of questions.
It's ask a question or go to lunch. So it's a difficult choice.
I'm just curious, why did you talk about soku and not sokuhi?
Oh, yes. So sokuhi is the full concept, which means is and is not. But in Japanese, the soku is taken over. Sokuhi is from Chinese sutras, translation of the sutra. The soku is taken over to mean both is and is not, just the soku by itself. Because in addition to the Chinese character, it also has a Japanese reading of sunawachi. So it's kind of capable of carrying both meanings. But yeah, strictly speaking, you're right. It's a logic of the tetralemma that we brought up earlier. The is not, is and is not, neither is nor is not. That's the sokuhi.
That's the
yes.
first quality, sokuhi.
Right. Yes, that would be the whole thing. But when they just want to talk about entailment, mutual entailment, they just use the word soku. Yeah.
Okay.
I was fascinated to hear with kenosis,
Yes.
because it's very much what I'm going to talk about in mine.
Uh-huh.
So it seems then that they want to take this Western notion, this Christian notion, and use it in the way that you
Yes.
suggested as a
Mhm.
way in for
Yes.
East and West to
Yes.
make some sort of
Yes.
contact here, philosophically,
Yes.
theologically.
Mhm.
I'm I'm fascinated why he's using this. Where did he get it from? I mean, what's his background on this?
Oh, I mean, they read Western theology, Western philosophy. They read all these things. What's interesting about this is, in the Western Christian tradition, we have kind of two traditions going on simultaneously, because we have a tradition of orthodoxy, which began from the early centuries, which led to creeds, which we pronounce at our religious services. Creeds which are based upon political and philosophical judgments and arguments. Creeds which, by the way, would be unintelligible to Jesus, and which, oddly enough, contain none of the teachings of Jesus. So they're suspicious for many people like me. But in any case, we have this dual tradition, and we have inquisitions, and all of that goes with it. And we have condemnations. We have official theology. We have orthodoxy. But we also have this underground tradition, the Hermetic tradition, the alchemical, the mystical, the Gnostic, all of which are essential to that overground tradition. Without that underground current, the overground tradition would never survive. And it creeps up into the surface in folk literature. I myself wrote a little book about the tales of the Brother Grimms as explanations of anti-Christian ideas that lived among ordinary people. But this underground tradition is essential for us. I mean, Thomas Aquinas' teacher was an alchemist, right? But at the same time, in the 13th century, we have a condemnation of alchemy and the Inquisition. So, all of this goes together. But here's the thing. In the East, we don't have that. There is no underground tradition. Everything is in the surface, because the center of religious belief is not doctrine, it's practice. Doctrine is at the periphery, and it's always a hoban, a useful means, an upaya. In any case, coming from this tradition, when they turned to the West, the Japanese philosophers were much less interested in scriptural scholars or in dogmatic theologians. They were interested in the esoteric tradition. So they loved the mystics, and they loved Eckhart. And actually, it's the Japanese philosophers' interest in Eckhart that has done a lot to spread the interest of Eckhart again in the West.
Yeah.
And you find all the heresies that you need in Eckhart. Enough to get you through, right? I mean, you need some heresy to get you through. Heresy meaning an alternative opinion, right? I mean, a choice, right? Yeah. So yeah, that's absolutely.
I would say though that there are more than one tradition within so-called Orthodox Christianity.
That's true as well,
Eastern,
of course.
Yeah, and this particular Eastern way of looking at it from Eastern Christian point of view can be very much more open viewed than it can be from a Western view sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Although you've still got these creeds and you've still got the institutions.
Yes.
If you look at the theology and speculative theology, it could be much more wider and open than often we give it credit for, I think.
Yes, and in fact, I would say that this Kyoto School of Philosophy, among the functions that it's carried out, not simply in the philosophical world, is that it's become the foundation for the most vibrant dialogue between Christians and Buddhists. This is a kind of a common ground, because it isn't. Oh, well, that's another thing that causes a problem. The word philosophy and the word religion were invented in the 19th century for Japan. They had no words for them. They invented the words and then taught them to Korea and China. And the difference between philosophy and religion, which existed in the West, religion meaning piety or general belief, not what we now define as religion, that didn't exist and still doesn't. So they'd say, well, can we get rid of the religious side of the Japanese? No, it's all together. There is no. Why introduce a distinction that never bothered them? So that's another one of the reasons for that.
I had just a brief question that relates to this, which is, you mentioned there were these translations and they didn't originally have the verb to be in these kind of things. I mean, what particular books were translated? Why was it those particular books that were translated?
Actually,
would it have been completely different if for accidental reasons they had some different batch of books?
No, it's these books are not philosophical books. The first books that were translated were Dutch books on anatomy on surgery, and they needed words for is
Right.
that they didn't have. Yeah. So,
What,
yeah.
what dates are we talking here?
well, in the 1700s already there were Dutch coming to Deshima, and but it wasn't really until the 19th century that the Japanese figured out a word for is. Yeah.
So it was a quick. So I'm very, very, very slowly teaching myself Japanese. The when you add des on
Dearu, that's right. That's
yeah,
the is.
That's the is.
it.
Okay.
Yes, that's the one.
Yeah.
That didn't exist in older texts. They just had nari.
Yeah, which is why then they use the hiragana for the desu because there is no symbol
Right.
for it.
There is no symbol. There's a Chinese symbol that they use now. It's not so much used in ancient Chinese, which was a Chinese word for here, kore, which became now the Chinese word for is. And the Chinese word for being, as I said, the character u, is to have at hand, to have present. It doesn't mean being, but then it became the word for being, and then people went back and retranslated the old texts and added being in there. It's kind of funny, being and nothingness. So then you get into, well, what did they think about Parmenides and so forth? Well, that wasn't their problem. Nothingness was never an opposite of being. It's just a translation fluke. Yeah.
Harold, did you have a question before lunch, and then we'll...
I wanted to ask you something, maybe very briefly, about the notion of engi, interconnectedness.
Yes.
Because when we think about a connection or a connectedness, then we think about it in terms of something that is connected, right? But when you talked about it, at some point it seemed to me, maybe I misunderstood you, that in some sense the connectedness is primary to what
Yes.
is connected.
Yeah, there is no substance in their thinking. So even the substance itself. Well, this was there was a reference to Whitehead made kind of toward the end of the first talk this morning. Whitehead's idea of actual occasions fits in very nicely with that idea. That in other words, that there are occasions. There aren't substances. There are occasions, and they're all vectors of forces.
Right.
Yeah.
I can see
Exactly. Yes.
Now, there is, just to make that connection and then I finish, there's this much discussed book by Ladyman and Ross. This is about quantum mechanics. And the title of that book is Everything Must Go. And what they say is that the correlations between all these things that actually must go are the primary stuff.
Yes.
Before we even talk about things.
Yes.
So the things or the objects or whatever it is
Yeah.
are something like manifestations within these fields of connectedness.
Yes.
Would that would fit that
Absolutely.
picture? I see.
Absolutely.
That's very nice.
Um,
I like it.
Actually, the idea of defining nothingness as engi is something that I came to myself. It isn't exactly in the Kyoto philosophers, and it happened one fall evening when the sun had gone down and the light inside the room was just a little more than the light outside. And I looked at the tree outside in the garden, and I could see my face in the tree. And then I started to think, I'm kind of connected to that tree, and that tree is connected to actually everything in the universe. Anywhere that light can go, that's connected somehow. It's connected to everything. And immediately I'm connected to the birds and the trees and to the grass and around it and everything. But indirectly, I'm connected to everything. And then I began to ask, is there anything that's connected always and everywhere to everything? Well, in the Western tradition, we'd say God. But I'd say, well, connectedness. That's the nature of it. I mean, tattered,
So the
but never
ontology
broken.
The ontology is relational, and not
Yes.
substantial.
Well, you can't say it's connected to itself because then you get Russell paradox type things.
Yeah, that was it. Yeah.
Can I just comment on that? Because as I read Latham and Ross, the relations are not themselves relational. They relate the other things. Whereas in the Mahayana tradition, it's relations all the way down.
Yes.
Even the relations are relational, and there's no ground.
Yes.
Which is
Even
what
the
Carla...
relations are relational, you say.
Yeah.
Yeah, everything is what it is because of the things it relates to, and that's true of the relations as well.
Oh, yeah.
And that's what you get in relational quantum
I
mechanics with
understand,
Calabrelli's
yes,
view.
yeah.
That's what he's trying to do.
You get that in the categorical stuff
That
too.
as well.
It's
So
relational, but
this is important in the sense that the relations exist, but relationality doesn't exist. Relationality is manifest in things that
I see.
exist.
Okay.
But the relationality, that would be a nothingness. And say, well, it's not nothing. Well, no, it's just because you got a bad press on the idea of nothing, with the no in there and everything. But it's, relatedness. Isn't that the greatest miracle of all? That everything's connected to everything, But, as I said, this wouldn't produce a science. This is not going to produce that objectivity, subject-object measurement, the treatment of the world that eventually gets us to quantum physics, where we say, hey, maybe we should go back and have another look at these guys, It wouldn't have gotten us there. Yeah.
Thanks. Great. Okay, I think we are in the orangery. Did I write that on the schedule for lunch?